complicated set of ways that's worked into the basic law, which is effectively the Constitution. Well, that's a law. You know, that organization, incidentally, you can give tax-free donations to in the United States. It's the only country in the world where American citizens can give tax-free donations to a sheer racist law, you know, a regime that's quite extreme. And you can do it because nobody knows about it. You know, and again, it's not a big secret. That law that I quoted is from 1953. There's been plenty of time to find out about it. There's a law in the state of Israel called an anti-racist law, of all things, which says that no political party can run if it rejects the principle that Israel is the sovereign state of the Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora, not the state of its citizens. You can't run if you object to that. It's called an anti-racist law. It's kind of curious, because it also had a provision in it to bar the American neo-Nazi Rabbi Kahana from running. They wanted him out of the political system, in fact, out of the country, because of his advocacy of the Nuremberg laws, Hitler's Nuremberg laws, and other such activities, and the thing was framed to bar him, but as a kind of a sop to the other side, they added the provision I just quoted. And if we proceed, there's very strong persecution of Christians, and in fact, just non-Jews. In fact, also, most American Jews who don't fit their condition of orthodoxy. So there is a serious, and we could go on, but there's a serious apartheid problem inside Israel. And in fact, it's leading to a very serious set of conflicts. There's something almost like a civil war brewing over issues of this kind, partly over the power of the extreme religious group, but there's a serious conflict because most of these laws were instituted by the secular, labor, socialist element. And in fact, you want to look at some of the ironies. This land law that I mentioned is now being challenged by the far right. Ariel Sharon, who I mentioned, and the Netanyahu government, they want to privatize land, okay, in line with their right-wing ideology. Privatizing land will mean breaking down this whole system of laws established by the secular left socialist element, which have as one of their consequences barring non-Jews from land. So the situation has many complicated convolutions when you look into it, but there is a serious apartheid-type problem inside Israel. It's not the same one that they had inside South Africa, but has its similarities. As to the extent that the territories are analogous to the Bantustans, which is more or less, it's in progress, it's not in existence. So they haven't yet set up the Bantustans. It's kind of like South Africa around 1960, But to the extent that analogy is correct, it was overcome in South Africa. In South Africa it was never even an issue. So like the African National Congress, you read their literature, they never even talked about the Bantustans. They regarded them so ridiculous, they didn't want to discuss them. The analog to what Israel's doing in the occupied territories was virtually not an issue. I mean, like a sentence about it and saying, yeah, nonsense. Because the struggle against apartheid was going on in the whole country without any differentiation between the Bantustans and the rest of the country. Well, that's not the same in Israel. There it's going on to the extent that it's going on at all, at least in any militant fashion, only in the territories, that is, the future Bantustans. Other things are happening in the country, but not that. So the analogies are not precise, but they're sort of there if you think about them, and you can learn from them. Anyway, going back to your first and crucial question, how was it overcome in South Africa? Well, in a complicated fashion. For one thing, the world power never strongly supported the apartheid regime. So the United States, if the United States had supported the apartheid regime around 1960, the same way it supports Israel, that would have been a genuine peace process too. And here, American liberals would have been talking about it as the peace process, and we've been talking about how saintly it is, and so on and so forth. But international business and South African business and the United States were not really happy with it. They didn't think this is going to be a useful settlement that will enable them to extract the resources of South Africa and get rich and do the important things. So the United States was kind of ambivalent about it. Didn't support it, didn't oppose it. If it had worked, the U.S. wouldn't have objected, but it wasn't going to support it. And the same was true of international, the state system and the, crucially, transnational business generally. They never liked it. So, for example, IBM and the big companies really didn't mind the Sullivan laws. I mean, as far as they were concerned, they could pull out and wait for a couple of black managers in there, and then they go back in, because they don't care. I mean, capitalism is basically not racist. It's just as happy to exploit anybody. You can, if it be women or blacks or robots or Chinese or whatever, as long as you can exploit them, it really doesn't matter. They're all just interchangeable atoms. So there was no inherent reason to maintain racism, and it was a bother. It was interfering with business, it was blowing the place up, and so on. So there were no powerful external pressures to maintain the apartheid system. Now the U.S. did support it, but it supported it as ways of, say, maintaining Mobutu in power and killing Lumumba and murdering a lot of people in Angola and that sort of business. They used South African mercenaries for that. So that, in that sense, the U.S. supported it, but it wasn't really supporting apartheid. It was just supporting part of its kind of international terror network, which needed South Africa. So that's one factor. In contrast, the United States is strongly supporting, in fact, is implementing the more or less comparable thing in the Israel-Palestine region. Another crucial difference is that there was plenty of opposition to apartheid inside the white society. Very powerful opposition, and very courageous and honorable people. So, the blacks who fought apartheid, they really suffered. I mean, years and years of prison and torture and exile and getting murdered and so on and so forth. But whites suffered too. I mean, plenty of them did oppose it, and opposed it strongly, and on principle too. It wasn't just out of, because they wanted to make more money. So there was a principled opposition within the white society, the ruling society, to the whole apartheid system, not just to the Bantustans. Again, even like the white, sort of human rights people, whatever you call them, they weren't talking about the Bantustans either. They also considered them too ludicrous to discuss, but they wanted to dismantle the whole apartheid system within the society, and that made a big difference. There's nothing really comparable to that in the Israel-Palestine case, and I should say a large part of the fault lies on the PLO in this case. I also, in Israel and Palestine, gave a talk at Birzeit, the Palestinian University, and I talked about that. I mean, on the assumption that wherever you talk, you should say the thing that people least want to hear, otherwise there's not much point about it. So talking at Birzeit, I mostly talked about the Palestinians and what they have failed to do, which is very significant. It's the only third world movement I've ever had anything to do with in my life. There have been a lot of them that never saw the point of establishing links inside the oppressor society, either inside Israel or, for that matter, inside the United States. So they did nothing to support a solidarity movement here, which would have been extremely easy, in my opinion. There have been efforts to try to change this for years and years and never got anywhere. And that's a major failure, and I think Palestinians have to think about it and learn from it. But, our problems there are other things we have to think about and learn. Anyhow, that's one difference, because there was a strong movement inside South Africa of whites and, so-called colored. I hate to use it's their term, and they still use it, so I'll use it. Well, colored there means Asian. Different. Right, yeah. So so it's like Malay or something. Yeah. I mean, everybody hates it, but they use it. So this whole mixture of things, there was there's a lot of solidarity internal to them, and they were really fighting together, and that made a big difference. That's nothing that we don't know about from our own history. So there are differences, but there are also lessons, plenty of them, and I think one should pay attention to them.
Yeah. The floor is now open for your questions and comments, and if you could work with the microphone.
Acknowledging your point that all significant power is being exercised by the United States and Israel, do you see any interests that are self-interests for the United States or for Israel, either politically or socially or economically, that would suggest that it's in the long-term benefit of either of those countries to change its behavior in any significant way? If so, would you characterize what those interests are?
Yeah, I think that's a very crucial question, but I think it ought to be rephrased. Whenever you talk about the interest of a country, you're already off track. Countries don't have interest. No. So are there...
American or Israeli corporate
people.
interest?
Well, corporate interest. Well, as a matter, see, actually that's complex too. So, for example, the forces behind the denationalization of land in Israel are coming from the right-wing business community. They don't want the internal racist system because it keeps the land nationalized, and they want it privatized, which means they want rich people to have it. Okay, and they don't really care that much if some of the rich people happen to be Palestinians or Christians or something like that. It's not going to happen much anyway because of the power system, just like it's not happening much in South Africa, I should say, because the power system mostly remains, little changes. As far as American corporate interests are concerned, it's quite it's very intriguing. It's an unusual case in American foreign policy. I mean, if we drop all this nonsense about nobility and saintliness and try to figure out what's happening, usually it's the case that major corporate sectors dominate the parts of foreign policy that are related to their interests. Like they may not care about other things that aren't related to their interests. The government, on the other hand, typically reflects a kind of a more general interest of the whole corporate system as a whole. That's why the Secretary of State usually comes from some law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell or something, or Dulles and Atchison and those guys. Those are guys who represent the general interests of the corporate sector, not some parochial interest like an oil company or something like that. But where a sector of the power system, private power system, has an interest in some region, they usually determine what happens there. So, like the oil companies have had enormous effect over State Department and so on. Now, in this case, it's interesting. The oil companies have not won out. So, when that conflict took place that I mentioned in 1971, that crucial one, as to whether to whether the United States should stay within the international consensus and continue to call for Israeli withdrawal, or whether it should shift to support Israeli expansion and withdraw from the international consensus, the oil companies were on the side of the international consensus. They thought the United States should keep its policy, and they called for Israeli withdrawal. And in fact, their representative in this conflict was William Rogers, Secretary of State, who has a background in oil interests. Kissinger was coming from another sector, a real sector of American power, but a different one. The military system, the military industries, the whole strategic analysis system that was trying to maintain Israel as part of the system of control of the oil region by force. This was, remember, the time at which what was called the Nixon Doctrine was being formulated. The idea of the Nixon Doctrine was that the United States was no longer in a position after the Vietnam War and so on to intervene massively everywhere in the world. So we had to delegate responsibility. We had to have what the Defense Department called local cops on the beat, who would run the local region under, police headquarters stays in Washington, but they do the local job. Now in the Middle East, there's a big job to be done. In fact, the intervention forces and so on have mostly been directed against the Middle East, always, because that's a crucial interest. The interest is ensuring that the profits from oil flow to the United States and England, primarily the United States, and not to the people of the region. That's a difficult thing to maintain, like people in the slums of Cairo can't seem to get it through their heads that the wealth of the oil producers should come to New York, not to the slums of Cairo. And the same with people in Saudi Arabia and, all over the place. So it's been necessary to keep beating them over the head, because they have these funny ideas. And in order to beat them over the head, you need regional enforcers. And the U.S. has a network of them, typically non-Arab. So Turkey, Israel, Iran when it was under the Shah, Pakistan. That's kind of like a network of regional gendarmes who maintain what's called stability, meaning the wealth comes here and nobody bothers our local managers. That's the name for that is stability. And Israel played a role in that system, powerful role. It won that, its spurs really in 1967 when it smashed Nasser. There was a kind of like a war going on between Nasser and Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And Nasser represented what they call radical Arab nationalism, meaning independent nationalism, which said we want to run our own lives and resources and so on. And the Saudi Arabian government is just, it's not a government. It's a family dictatorship, which was what the British used to call an Arab facade that manages the place under British rule. And they were being threatened by the radical nationalist currents spearheaded by Nasser, even inside Saudi Arabia. And Israel put an end to that by wiping out Nasser and eliminating, the major Arab states and so on. And they won a lot of points for that. It happened again in 1970, at the time of Black September, when Israel intervened to prevent potential Syrian support for Palestinians who were being killed off by the Jordanians, the U.S. British ally. And the issue really at the time was, well, do we go along with the local interests of the oil companies, who are perfectly happy to see a Palestinian state or, Israeli withdrawal? They don't really care. They just want to do their business and make their money. Or do we go along with a big strategic conception of how to maintain the kind of control which, in fact, they think will ultimately be in the interest of the oil corporations too? And that's a debatable point, if you forget all moral considerations, you forget that human beings matter, and you enter into the world of actual political choices as made, then it's debatable. It's not obvious which way to go, and you can understand why there's a conflict. Since that time, the conflict remains. So if you read, say, Mobil Corporation ads in the New York Times and so on, they're rather dovish, on this issue. So they don't. If the U.S. had been willing to go along, for example, in 1976, the Security Council debated a resolution calling for a two-state settlement, incorporating UN 242, but saying Palestinian state. It was supported by the entire world. It was supported by Europe, by the non-aligned countries, by the Arab states, by the PLO, everybody. Israel opposed it, the United States vetoed it. But the oil companies would have gone along with it, quite happily, in fact. However, they lost out in that conflict. And so it remains. It's an intricate issue in American politics. My own feeling is that if the population has had almost no role in this, it's just not been a political issue. And part of the reason the population has no role is they haven't got a clue as to what's going on. Virtually nobody has any idea how much aid the United States is giving to Israel. And even fewer people know that the aid to the oil monarchs is even greater. So the aid, the U.S. taxpayers, what U.S. taxpayers have paid to the Arab facade, the oil monarchies that run, make sure that the profits come here, at least, as long as anybody was counting, it dwarfed what went to Israel. But nobody knows that either, It was done through various tax shenanigans. And the things that I've been talking about the diplomacy, are virtually unknown. Even the official U.S. policy, say of the Baker administration, is unknown. You only know it if you read some, marginal literature or you look up actual original documents. Since all the stuff is kind of out of the public arena, the public plays no role. And if it did, I suspect there could be a shift in American policy. As in the case of South Africa. The anti-apartheid movement made a big difference. There couldn't have been an anti-apartheid movement if nobody knew there was any apartheid. So it's a complex issue. I don't think there's a simple answer. I think here the intellectual establishment, the people we live among, have a a lot of responsibility for what happened. They're the ones who are keeping it quiet.
I have three questions, and I think it's important as far as the peace process goes. The first one is, will Israel pull out of Lebanon? That's number one. Number two, Israel plans on building a dam on a river by the Golan Heights. The previous administration was going to put it several miles below the Golan Heights. This administration, under Ariel Sharon, is planning on putting it a few miles north. And the last, which I think is the most important and hasn't been mentioned, is you think that the split in the Israeli Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox religion of converts is going to affect their support of the people that are not ultra-Orthodox in this country and have any effect?
Well, on Israel and Lebanon, there is a UN resolution from March 1978, which actually the U.S. voted for, calling on Israel to leave Lebanon immediately and unconditionally. Okay, that was March 1978. Well, they haven't left immediately or unconditionally, and the reason is the U.S. tells them, forget it. You can stay there, and we'll keep paying you to stay there. And that'll change when the U.S. decides it's time for them to leave. Now it's possible that they may decide on their own, because it's becoming very costly. There's no strategic point in staying there. They're not. By now, it's kind of a policy that's feeding on itself. There's no threat that anybody knows of to northern Israel. In fact, the threat is mostly coming from their being there. So, for example, up until 1992, before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon came after there had been nothing, a year of what's called in the scholarly literature quiet on the Lebanese border, meaning nothing coming south but plenty of things going north. Like Israel was bombing like mad all over the place and killing all sorts of people, but there was nothing going from north to south, so that's called quiet on the Lebanese border. And then Israel invaded, and then it became not quiet. But even then, after the invasion, until I think it was in March or so, 1992, not a single rocket or anything else, not a pistol was shot across the border. What happened at that time was that the Rabin government assassinated a Lebanese cleric and his family, in a car. And after that, attacks started coming. And if you look at the record closely, you'll find that there are rockets, Katyusha rockets and so on, going from north to south to the northern settlements, but almost invariably in response to some Israeli action against civilians somewhere in Lebanon. They go on all the time. Mostly they're not even reported, or they get a few lines and so on. And by now the thing is feeding on itself. Israel has a mercenary army in the south which runs the southern region by sheer terror, and they just don't want to leave them, and they've, complicated things, but they don't really have all that much, the interests that lie behind it are not overwhelming, and in fact it's costing Israel a lot of soldiers now. They're getting, they're not able to handle the resistance, which is killing a lot of Israeli soldiers. And they may just pull out for that reason. In fact, one of the people who's calling for a pullout is the same Ariel Sharon. Sharon, the ultra-right general who sort of led the invasion of Lebanon, is now saying, look, it's ridiculous, let's get out. So they might leave on their own, or if the United States decides that they're going to leave, they'll leave. If the U.S. decides it's...
I'm Mark Berzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.